The Walker in the Attic, Edogawa Rampo. Perhaps it was a kind of mental illness. No matter what pastime, occupation, or thing Goda Saburo tried, the world just never seemed interesting to him. After leaving school, and he only attended enough school days a year to count them, he tried every occupation he could think of. But he had yet to find a single one that he felt was worth dedicating his life to. Perhaps there was no occupation in this world that satisfied him. He bounced from occupation to occupation for as long as a year, or as short as a month. And then finally he gave up, and now he no longer looked for a new occupation, but simply did nothing, living day to day in a boring way. It was the same with leisure. He tried every kind of game imaginable, from karuta, billiards, tennis, swimming, mountain climbing, go, shogi, and even various forms of gambling, too numerous to list here. And he even bought up books like the Encyclopedia of Entertainment, searching and trying them all. But just like with his profession, there was nothing that really suited him, and he was always disappointed. But in this world, there are two wonderful pleasures that no man could ever tire of in his lifetime: women and alcohol. You would surely say the same. Still, Goda Saburo strangely felt no interest in these two things. Perhaps alcohol is not suited to his constitution, so he cannot drink a drop of it. And as for women, of course, that does not mean he does not desire them, and he does have his fair share of fun. But that said, he just cannot feel that they give him a reason to live. It would be better to die than to continue living in such an uninteresting world. He often thought this way. However, even he possessed an instinct to cherish life, and even though he had been saying, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die," he had continued to live on at the age of 25. He received a certain amount of money from his parents every month, so he would have no trouble making a living even if he left his job. Perhaps it was this sense of security that had led him to become so carefree. So he tried hard to make at least a somewhat enjoyable life with the money he received. For example, just like with his occupations and pastimes, he changed lodgings frequently. To put it a bit dramatically, he knew all the boarding houses in Tokyo intimately. He would stay in one for a month or even a week and then immediately move to another. Of course, in between, he also traveled like a wanderer. On other occasions, he retreated into the mountains like a hermit. But accustomed to living in the city, he could not stay in the lonely countryside for long. After going on a short trip, he would find himself returning to Tokyo, drawn by the city's lights and hustle and bustle. Needless to say, he changed lodgings each time. The new home he moved into was Toikan, a brand new boarding house with newly built walls that were still damp. And it was here that he discovered a wonderful joy, and this story revolves around a murder case related to his newfound discovery. But before I move in that direction, I must tell you a little about how our protagonist, Goda Saburo, became acquainted with the amateur detective Akechi Kogoro and developed a new interest in crime, something he had previously been completely unaware of. The two men first became acquainted when they happened to meet at a cafe. Saburo's friend, who was with him at the time, knew Akechi and introduced him to Saburo. Saburo was instantly captivated by Akechi's intelligent looks, the way he spoke, and the way he carried himself. From then on, he began to visit him frequently, and they became so close that Akechi would sometimes come over to Saburo's boarding house to hang out. Perhaps Akechi was interested in Saburo's pathological personality as a form of research material. But Saburo genuinely enjoyed hearing Akechi's various fascinating crime tales. The story of Dr. Webster, who murdered a colleague and tried to burn the body to white ash in the laboratory's oven. The murder conviction of Eugene Airhem, who was fluent in several languages and even made a major discovery in linguistics. Stories about Henry Wainwright, the insurance fiend and brilliant literary critic. Noguchi Osaburo tried to cure his father-in-law's leprosy by stewing the flesh of a child and using the extract from it. And then there were tales of brutal crimes by characters like Bluebeard Landrew and Armstrong, who married and then murdered countless women. How delighted these stories must have brought to the utterly bored Saburo. Listening to Akechi's eloquent speech, these crime tales appeared vividly before Saburo's eyes, filled with boundless fascination, like gaudy, brilliantly colored picture scrolls. After meeting Akechi for 2 or 3 months, Saburo seemed to have almost forgotten the dullness of this world. He bought up all kinds of books on crime and devoured them every day. Among those books were works by Poe, Hoffman, Gaboriau, Bois-Guilbert, and various other detective novels. Ah, there are still such interesting things in the world, he would think, breathing a sigh of relief every time he closed the last page of a book. He even began to think boldly that, if possible, he would like to have the same spectacular experiences as the protagonists in those crime stories. But no matter how he thought about it, Saburo simply did not want to become a criminal in the eyes of the law. He still did not have the courage to indulge in pleasure, even to the point of ignoring the grief and humiliation of his parents, siblings, and relatives. According to various books, no matter how ingenious a crime, there is always a flaw somewhere that leads to its detection, and it seemed completely impossible for a person to elude the police for their entire life, with very few exceptions. That was simply terrifying to him. His misfortune was that he had no interest in anything in the world, and that of all things, he felt an inexplicable fascination with crime. And what was even more unfortunate was that he was unable to commit crime for fear of being discovered. So after reading all the books he could get his hands on, he began to imitate crime. Since it was just imitating, of course, there was no need to fear punishment. For example, he did something like this. He once again became interested in Asakusa, a place he had long since grown tired of. The Asakusa amusement park, which looked like a toy box had been dumped open and various nasty paints had been drizzled on top, was the perfect stage for someone with a penchant for crime. He preferred to wander the narrow, dark alleys between the huts, barely wide enough for one person to pass through, or the strangely deserted vacant lots behind the public toilets, which made one wonder if Asakusa even had that much space. He would go around drawing arrows on the walls in chalk, as if a criminal were communicating with his kind. When he spotted a wealthy-looking passerby, he would follow them wherever they went, pretending to be a pickpocket. He would place pieces of paper with strange coded messages written on them, which always contained something related to a horrific murder. Between the wooden boards of park benches, hide in the shade of a tree, and wait for someone to discover them, and he would amuse himself by playing various similar games. He also often disguised himself and wandered from town to town. He tried various disguises, such as becoming a laborer, a beggar, or a student. But cross-dressing was what most pleased his pathological tendencies. To do this, he sold off his kimonos, watches, and other items to make money, and bought expensive wigs and old women's clothes. He then spent a long time transforming into a woman, pulled a cloak over his head, and left the boarding house entrance late at night. He would then take off his cloak at a suitable spot, and sometimes he would wander around a lonely park, or sometimes he would enter a theater as the show was about to end, and deliberately blend into the men's section, or he would even go so far as to play pranks on them. Then, thanks to the illusion created by his clothing, he would feel like a playful woman, and delight in imagining how he could toy with various men at will. However, although these imitations of crime satisfied his desires to a certain extent, and sometimes led to some amusing incidents that provided him with enough comfort for a while, the imitations were, after all, just imitations. And since there was no danger, and the appeal of crime lies in the danger, depending on how you look at it, they lacked interest and did not have the power to keep him ecstatic for long. After about 3 months, he gradually began to distance himself from this enjoyment, and his relationship with Akechi, which he had once so attracted to, gradually became tiresome. I hope that the above story has given you an understanding of Saburo's dealings with Akechi Kogoro, as well as Saburo's criminal tendencies. Now let's return to our main topic and discuss the joys that Saburo discovered at his newly built boarding house, Toikan. It had been more than a year since Saburo began dating Akechi that the construction of Toikan was completed and he moved there. As a result, he no longer had any interest in pretending to commit crimes, but with no other alternative entertainment, he found it difficult to pass the long, boring days. When he first moved to Toikan, he made new friends and found some distraction. But humans are truly boring creatures. No matter where he went, all he found was people repeating the same thoughts over and over again, with the same expressions and in the same words. Even though he had gone to the trouble of changing lodgings and interacting with new people, within a week or so he would once again sink into a depthless boredom. And then one day, about 10 days after moving to Toikan, out of boredom, he suddenly came up with a strange idea. In his room, which was on the second floor, there was a one-room closet next to a cheap-looking alcove, and inside it, exactly halfway between the lintel and the threshold, there was a sturdy shelf divided into an upper and lower level. He kept several suits on the lower level and his futon on the upper level, but instead of taking the futon out every time and laying it out in the middle of the room, what if he just kept the futon stacked on top of him on the shelf like a bed and could climb up on it to sleep when he got sleepy? That's what he thought. If this had been a boarding house he had stayed in before, even if there had been a similar shelf in the closet, the walls would have been terribly dirty, and there would have been cobwebs on the ceiling, and he probably wouldn't have felt the slightest bit inclined to sleep there. However, this closet had only recently been built, so it was extremely clean. The ceiling was pure white, and there wasn't a single stain on the smooth yellow-painted walls. And perhaps it was because of the way the shelves were made, but the overall feel somehow reminded him of a bunk on a ship. And strangely enough, he even felt a temptation to try sleeping there for a while. So he decided to start sleeping in the closet that night. Each room in this boarding house could be locked from the inside, so maids and others couldn't enter without permission, and he could continue his strange behavior in peace. When he tried sleeping there, it felt even better than he expected. There was something strange about the feeling of stacking 4 futons, lying down on them, and gazing at the ceiling looming just 2 feet above his eyes. With the sliding doors tightly closed and watching the threads of electric light filtering in through the gaps, he felt like a character in a detective novel, which was a delight. It was also interesting to open them a little and peer into his own room, feeling like a thief peeking into someone else's room, imagining all sorts of passionate scenes. Sometimes he would sneak into the closet in the middle of the day, and inside the rectangular box measuring 3 feet, puff on his favorite cigarettes while indulging in rambling daydreams. At such times, so much white smoke would leak out from the gaps in the closed sliding doors that it seemed as if a fire had started inside the closet. However, as he continued this strange behavior for 2 or 3 days, he once again noticed something strange. Easily bored, by the 3rd day he had lost interest in his bed in the closet, and out of loneliness he would scribble on the walls and the ceiling boards that he could reach while sleeping. One day, he suddenly noticed that one of the ceiling boards just above his head was moving slightly, as if someone had forgotten to hammer a nail into it. Wondering what was wrong, he tried to push it up with his hand, and it came free easily. But strangely, when he let go, it went back into place as if spring-loaded, even though it wasn't nailed in any place. It felt as if someone was pressing down from above. Suddenly, Saburo began to feel uneasy, wondering if there might be some kind of living creature, a large snake or something, living on this ceiling board. But he didn't want to just run away, so he continued to push with his hand. Not only did he feel a heavy weight, but every time he moved the board, he heard a dull rumbling sound above it. Something was really wrong. So he decided to take a risk and push the board away with all his might, and immediately he heard a rattling sound and something fell down from above. Fortunately, he was able to quickly jump aside, but if he hadn't, he would have been hit by the object and seriously injured. What a pain! However, when he looked at the falling item, he was quite shocked, as he had hoped to find something unusual. It was nothing more than a small lump of stone, like a pickling stone. If you think about it, it's not that strange at all. An electrician had deliberately removed one of the ceiling panels to make way for a passageway into the attic, and had weighed it down with a lump of stone to prevent mice and other animals from getting into the closet. It was truly a far-fetched comedy. But that comedy led Goda Saburo to discover a wonderful joy. For a while he stared at the hole in the ceiling above his head, which looked like the entrance to a cave. But then, driven by his natural curiosity, he timidly stuck his head through the hole and looked around, wondering what on earth an attic was like. It was morning, and the sun was already shining down on the roof, with many thin rays of light streaming into the attic cavity from various gaps, like countless searchlights of all sizes, making it surprisingly bright. The first thing that caught his eye was the thick, twisted, giant, snake-like ridgepole, laid out vertically. Although it was bright, he was only in the attic, and he couldn't see very far. And since the building was a long, narrow boarding house, the ridgepole was indeed long, but it seemed to stretch out into the distance, with the far end appearing hazy. And, at right angles to the ridge beam, numerous beams, the equivalent of the ribs of a giant snake, protruded on both sides, following the slope of the roof. That alone was a magnificent sight, but on top of that, countless thin rods hung down from the beams to support the ceiling, making it feel like looking into the inside of a limestone cave. "This is wonderful," Saburo couldn't help but mutter after looking around the attic. Pathologically, he was not attracted by ordinary worldly interests, and instead found an indescribable fascination with these things, which to ordinary people might seem trivial. From that day on, his attic walks began. Night or day, whenever he had free time, he would crawl along the ridgepole and beams, trying not to make any noise like a thieving cat. Fortunately, since the house had just been built, there were no spider webs, soot, or dust, which are common in attics, and not even a trace of mouse dirt. Therefore, there was no need to worry about his clothes or hands and feet getting dirty. He walked around the attic in his shirt sleeve as he pleased. It was spring, and even though it was the attic, it wasn't particularly hot or cold. The building at Toei-kan was constructed in a style common to boarding houses, with a central courtyard surrounded by rooms arranged in a grid pattern. Consequently, the attic space followed this layout continuously, with no dead ends. Starting from the attic in his room, he walked around in a circle and returned to the top of his room. The rooms below are separated by walls that look very strict, and the doorways even have metal fittings to secure them. But when you go up into the attic, it's amazing how open it feels. You are free to walk around above anyone's room. If you so wished, there are stone blocks here and there, similar to the one in Saburo's room, that you can use to sneak into someone else's room and commit theft. As I said before, stealing through the hallway is extremely dangerous, as not only are there people watching on all sides of the box-shaped building, but there's no telling when other residents or maids might pass by. However, there is absolutely no risk from the attic passage. Also here, you are free to peek into other people's secrets as you please. Even though it's a new building, it's a cheap boarding house, so there are gaps everywhere in the ceiling. You wouldn't notice it from inside the room, but when you look from the dark attic, you're surprised at how large the gaps are. And in rare cases, you might even find a knothole. Discovering this attic, one of Goda Saburo's most ideal settings, his criminal tendencies, which he had somehow forgotten, began to well up again. On this setting, he was sure he would be able to perform a much more stimulating criminal impersonation than he had attempted back then. The thought of this made him overjoyed. How could he have never noticed such an interesting place so close by? Stalking through the dark world like a monster, spying on the secrets of all 20 or so residents of the second floor of Toei-kan, one after the other, was enough to bring joy to Saburo. And for the first time in a long time, he even felt a sense of purpose in life. To make this attic stroll even more interesting, he also made sure to dress like a real criminal. A tight-fitting dark brown woolen shirt and matching trousers. Ideally, he would have liked to wear a jet black shirt like the female robber Protea he had seen in a motion picture a long time ago. But unfortunately, he didn't have anything like that, so he decided to make do. He also put on tabi socks and gloves. The attic is made of nothing but rough-hewn wood, so there's little to worry about leaving fingerprints. And in his hand was a pistol, but even if he wanted one, he didn't have one, so he decided to use a flashlight. Late at night, unlike daytime, the amount of light seeping through was extremely faint. In the darkness where he couldn't see an inch ahead, he crept along the ridgepole, careful not to make a sound. As he moved like that, he felt strangely excited, as if he had become a snake, slithering around the thick tree trunk. For some reason, that excitement was unbearably delightful to him. And so, for several days, he continued his ecstatic attic walk. As expected, many delightful events occurred during this time, enough to fill a novel in its entirety. However, as these are not directly related to the main topic of this story, I will unfortunately have to shorten it and limit myself to mentioning only a few brief examples. Unless you have actually tried it, it is probably impossible to imagine just how strangely fascinating it is to peek through the ceiling. Even if nothing special is happening below, it's fascinating enough just to observe people revealing their true nature, believing that no one is watching. If you look closely, he's quite surprised to discover that some people's posture, demeanor, and even facial expressions change completely when they're alone compared to when others are nearby. Also, unlike the usual side-on viewing, where you're looking at the same horizon, this view from directly above makes an ordinary living room seem quite strange, due to the difference in viewing angle. People's heads and shoulders are the main focus, and the upper surfaces of bookcases, desks, chests of drawers, and braziers are the only surfaces that are visible. And the walls are barely visible. Instead, tatami mats are spread out over the backs of all the items. This interest is there even when nothing is happening, and often comical, tragic, or even horrific scenes unfold. An office worker who normally spouts radical anti-capitalist arguments when no one is looking takes out the notice of his newly received pay increase from his bag, puts it away, and gazes at it over and over again with glee. A certain stock trader who always wears a loose, ripped kimono and displays a bold, extravagant air when it comes time to go to bed. Not only does he carefully fold the kimono that he had worn so carelessly during the day and lay it under the floor like a woman, but when it appears to have gotten stained, he carefully licks it with his mouth. It is said that the best way to remove small stains from kimono is with your mouth. As if he is doing a kind of dry cleaning. He could watch as much as he wanted without any hesitation. As he watched, as he saw a pimple-faced young man who claimed to be a baseball player at a certain university, placing a note to the maid on the dinner tray with a timidity unbecoming of an athlete. Then thinking about it, pulling away and looking again, then putting it back on, fidgeting and repeating the same thing over and over again. And even a man boldly bringing in a prostitute and engaging in some horrifically crazy antics that I hesitate to describe here. Saburo also became interested in studying the emotional conflicts between lodgers and other lodgers. The same people change their attitudes depending on who they are with. Some people will come into the next room and curse at someone they've been smiling and talking to until just now as if they were in sworn enemy. While others, like bats, will stick out their tongues in the background, saying whatever suits them wherever they go. And when it comes to a female lodger, a female art student living on the second floor of Toiken, it becomes even more interesting. It's far from a love triangle. Not only is the complex relationship, with its pentagons and hexagons, clearly visible, but the true intentions of each of the other competitors, unknown to any of them, are clearly visible to only an outsider like the attic walker. In fairy tales, there's a thing called an invisibility cloak, and Saburo in the attic is practically wearing that same cloak. It would have been even more interesting if he could have peeled back the ceiling boards in other people's rooms, sneaked in, and played all sorts of pranks on them. But Saburo didn't have the courage to do so. About once every 3 rooms there was a passageway weighted down with stone, just like the one in Saburo's room. So sneaking in would be easy, but there was no telling when the room's owner might return. And even if they didn't, the windows were all made of clear glass shoji screens. So there was the risk of being spotted from outside. What's more, you'd have to flip back a ceiling board, climb down into the closet, open a sliding door, crawl into your room, then climb back up onto the closet shelves and return to the attic. There was no guarantee that you wouldn't make some noise along the way. If anyone noticed you from the hallway or the next room, it would be all over. So one night, Saburo had finished his walk around the house and was climbing from beam to beam on his way back to his room, when he suddenly spotted a faint gap in the ceiling in one corner of the building, directly opposite his own. Across the garden, he discovered a previously unnoticed gap. It was cloud-shaped, about 2 inches in diameter, and shining a beam of light thinner than a thread. Wondering what it was, he quietly turned on his flashlight and took a look. He discovered it was a fairly large knot in the wood, more than half of which was detached from the surrounding boards. But the other half was just barely connected, narrowly avoiding forming a knothole. It looked like it would come apart easily if he just pried it apart with his fingernails. So Saburo looked down through the gap outside and confirmed that the occupant of the room was already asleep. Then, being careful not to make any noise, he finally managed to peel it off after a long time. Fortunately, the knothole left after removal tapers downward like a sake cup. So as long as you simply plug the knot back in, it won't fall out. This way, no one will ever notice such a large peephole exists there. Thinking this was a good idea, he peered down through the knothole. Unlike the other gaps, which were long vertically but only about 1 centimeter wide, even the narrower bottom part of this one was over 3 centimeters in diameter, so the entire room was easily visible. Saburo couldn't help but take a detour to look around the room. And by coincidence, it was the room of Endo, the lodger at Toei Hall whom Saburo hated the most. A dental school graduate named Endo, currently working as an assistant at a dentist's office somewhere. Endo's oddly flat, disgusting face was even flatter as he lay sleeping right below his eyes. Being an absurdly meticulous man, his room was more tidy than any of the other lodgers. The position of the stationery on the desk, the arrangement of the books in the bookcase, the way the futon was laid out, the unusually shaped alarm clock next to the pillow, perhaps an imported item, the lacquerware cigarette case, the colored glass ashtray. All of these things prove that the person depicted is an extremely neat and tidy person, the kind of nervous person who would pick at the corners of a tiered box with a toothpick. Endo also had very well-behaved sleeping posture. However, what seemed out of place with these scenes was the fact that he was snoring with his mouth wide open, like thunder. Saburo frowned as he gazed at Endo's sleeping face, as if looking at something dirty. His face is, if you will, quite handsome. And indeed, as he himself boasted, it might be a face that women would like. But what a drawn-out, long-winded face he had. He had thick hair, a strangely narrow forehead, despite his long face, short eyebrows, narrow eyes, wrinkles at the corners of his eyes that looked like he was always smiling, a long nose, and an unusually large mouth. Saburo just couldn't like this mouth. From the bottom of his nose, his upper and lower jaws jutted out in a step, and in a strange contrast to his pale face, large purple lips were spread across that area. And perhaps he had rhinitis, as his nose was always stuffy, and he was breathing with his big mouth wide open. His snoring when he slept was probably due to his nasal problem. Whenever Saburo saw Endo's face, he would get an itch down his spine and feel like he wanted to suddenly punch Endo in the flat cheeks. And as he watched Endo's sleeping face, a strange thought suddenly occurred to Saburo. It was this. If he spit through the knothole, surely it would fit right into Endo's wide-open mouth. That's because his mouth was located directly below the knothole, as if it had been custom-made for him. Saburo pulled out the string from the trousers he was wearing, draped it vertically over the knothole, and placing one eye on the string, looked as if aiming a gun, and, by a strange coincidence, the string, the knothole, and Endo's mouth all appeared to be exactly one point. He realized that if he spat through the knothole, it would definitely fall into Endo's mouth. However, there was no way he could actually spit on him, so Saburo filled the knothole back in place and was about to leave when suddenly a terrifying thought flashed through his mind. Involuntarily, in the darkness of the attic, he turned pale and began trembling. The thought was of killing Endo, someone he held no grudge against. Not only did he hold no grudge against Endo, but it had only been less than 2 weeks since they had known each other. It just so happened that the two of them were moving on the same day, and since then they had only visited each other's rooms a few times. Not that they had any deep relationship. So why did Saburo think of killing Endo? As I said, Endo's appearance and behavior were so repulsive that he wanted to hit him, which contributed to his desire to kill him to some extent. But Saburo's main motivation for this thought was not the person he was trying to kill, but simply his interest in the act of murder itself. As I've said before, Saburo's mental state is extremely perverse. He suffers from a disorder that could be described as a criminal fetish. And of all the crimes, murder is the one that he finds most appealing, so it's no coincidence that such thoughts arose. However, up until now, even if he had often had the urge to kill, he had never once considered carrying it out, fearing being discovered. However, with Endo now, it seemed likely that he would be able to commit a murder without arousing any suspicion or worrying about discovery. As long as there was no danger to himself, Saburo paid no heed to such considerations, even if the victim was a complete stranger. Rather, the more brutal the murder, the more his abnormal desires were satisfied. So why, if he killed Endo, would he not be found guilty of murder? At least that's what Saburo believed. The reason was as follows. It was about 4 or 5 days after moving into Toei Hall. Saburo went to a local cafe with a fellow lodger he had just become close with. Endo was also there at the cafe, and the three of them sat at a table and had drinks. Although Saburo, who disliked alcohol, drank coffee, and all three of them felt much better when they returned to their boarding house. But Endo, who was a little drunk after drinking a little, forced the two of them into his room, saying, "Come to my room." Endo was having fun by himself, and not minding that it was getting late, he called a maid to make him tea and continued to boast about his love life. It was that night that Saburo began to dislike him. Endo licked his red, flushed lips and said with a hint of pride, "You see, I once nearly committed a love suicide with the woman. It was back when I was still in school. Well, mine was medical school, you know. Getting poison was easy. So I got enough morphine for us both to die easily, and we headed out to Shiobara." As he said this, he unsteadily rose to his feet, went to the closet, opened the rattling sliding door, and from the bottom of a wooden box piled inside, he found a tiny brown bottle, the size of the tip of his little finger, and handed it to his listener. At the bottom of the bottle, there was a tiny bit of sparkling powder. That's it. This would be enough to kill 2 people. But you guys don't talk about this to outsiders. And his boastful tales of romance went on, endlessly. But Saburo now unexpectedly recalled the poison from that time. Dropping poison through a knothole in the ceiling and killing someone. What a fantastic, fantastic crime. He was completely captivated by the idea. Upon reflection, it is clear that this method was nothing but dramatic and offered little chance of success. Moreover, there must have been countless simpler ways to commit murder without resorting to such elaborate measures. Yet captivated by this bizarre notion, he had no room left to consider anything else. And now one convenient logic for this plan after another was popping into his head. First, he needed to steal the drug, but that wouldn't be difficult. If he visited Endo's room and talked to him, he would eventually leave to go to the bathroom or something. In that spare time, he would simply take out the small brown vial from the wooden box. Endo wasn't constantly checking the bottom of the wooden box, so he probably wouldn't notice for 2 or 3 days. Even if he did notice, possessing such poison was already illegal, so it wasn't going to become public knowledge, and if he did it properly, no one would even know who had stolen it. Wouldn't it be easier to sneak in through the ceiling instead? No, that would be dangerous. As I said before, there was no telling when the owner of the room would return, and there was also the worry of being seen through the glass window. First of all, there is no stone-placed entrance in the ceiling of Endo's room like there is in Saburo's. How could he do something as dangerous as peeling back the ceiling boards that were nailed down and sneaking in? Now, once I got the powder, all I had to do was dissolve it in water and drip it into Endo's big mouth, which was always open due to his nasal disease. The only worry was whether he would be able to swallow it properly, but I think that would be fine. After all, it was a very small amount of medicine, and if he had dissolved it thickly, only a few drops would be enough. So if he was deep asleep, he probably wouldn't even notice. And even if he did notice, he probably wouldn't have time to spit it out. Saburo was well aware that morphine was a bitter drug, but even if it was bitter, the amount was small, and if he mixed in some sugar on top, there was no need to worry about it failing. No one would ever imagine that poison would fall from the ceiling, so there's no way Endo would have noticed it in an instant. However, is it possible that the amount is too much or too little for Endo's constitution, and that Endo will simply suffer agony without dying? That's the problem. Indeed, it would be very unfortunate if that were to happen, but there is no need to worry about it putting Saburo in any danger. That's because I've decided to put the knotholes back on, and besides, there's no dust in the attic yet, so no traces would be left behind. Fingerprints are protected by gloves. Even if it were discovered that poison had been dropped from the ceiling, there's no way anyone would know who did it. Moreover, it is common knowledge that he and Endo only recently became acquainted and were not on such terms as to harbor any grudge against each other, so there is no reason for him to be under suspicion. This was the convenient logic Saburo came up with in the attic, and again after returning to his room. Readers may already have noticed that even if the above steps work, there is another significant error. Strangely, however, he was completely unaware of this until he finally began to put his plan into action. It was 4 or 5 days later that Saburo found a convenient time to visit Endo's room. Of course, during that time he had thought over the plan over and over again, and was able to determine that it was safe and risk-free. He also added various new ideas. For example, he came up with a way to dispose of the poison bottle. If he were to successfully kill Endo, he decided to drop the bottle through a knothole. By doing so, he would gain 2 benefits. First, he would no longer need to hide the bottle, which if discovered, could provide an important clue. Secondly, if a container of poison had been found near the dead person, anyone would undoubtedly assume that Endo had committed suicide. And the fact that the bottle belonged to Endo would surely be proven by the man who had one day listened to Endo's boastful tales together with Saburo. What's even more convenient is that Endo made sure to lock his door tightly every night before going to bed. Not only the entrance, but the windows were also fastened with metal fittings from the inside, making it absolutely impossible to enter from the outside. That day, with great patience, Saburo chatted at length with Endo, whose face made him disgusted just by looking at him. As they talked, he often subtly hinted at murderous intent and felt the extremely dangerous desire to intimidate the other person, but he just barely managed to stop it from arising. "I'll kill you soon in a way that leaves no evidence whatsoever. Now is the only time you'll be able to do that and talk endlessly like a woman. Keep talking while you can." Saburo repeated this to himself as he watched his man's large lips, moving endlessly. He couldn't help but feel amused at the thought that this man would soon be reduced to a blistered corpse. As they continued talking, sure enough, Endo got up to go to the toilet. It must have been around 10 o'clock at night, and Saburo was keeping a sharp eye on his surroundings, thoroughly checking out the glass window and such. He quietly but quickly opened the closet and found the medicine bottle in his wooden box. He had seen the hiding place before, so it wasn't difficult to find. But as expected, his heart was pounding, and a cold sweat was running down his armpits. To tell the truth, the most dangerous part of his latest plan was stealing the poison. What if Endo suddenly came back? Or what if someone happened to see it? But he thought about it this way. If someone saw him, or even if no one did, what should he do if Endo noticed the medicine bottle was missing? In such a case, he would know by carefully observing Endo's behavior, especially since he had the advantage of the ceiling peephole. He just needed to refrain from killing him. Simply stealing poison wouldn't be a serious crime after all. Anyway, in the end, he had successfully obtained the vial without being seen by anyone. So shortly after Endo returned from the toilet, he casually ended the conversation and returned to his room. Then, drawing the curtains tightly to cover the windows, he locked the front door and sat down at his desk. With a thrill in his heart, he took out a cute brown bottle from his pocket and gazed at it intently.
Hello everyone, it's been a while. This time, we present the first part of The Walker in the Attic. This was the story before Saburo Goda planned and carried out his horrific crime. What do you think will happen to Saburo in the second part next time? Look forward to seeing how his fate unfolds at the end of October. Until then, see you again.